You know what's wild? During World War II, while thousands of soldiers were fighting and dying across Europe, there was a top-secret unit whose greatest weapon wasn't bullets or bombs. It was art, paint, rubber tanks, and the ability to lie so convincingly that they fooled the entire German army more than 20 times. This is the story of the Ghost Army. And I promise you, this is going to change everything you thought you knew about warfare. Before we jump in, if you're into history that sounds too crazy to be true, you're going to want to stick around for this channel. Hit that subscribe button because we're digging into the stories they don't teach you in school. So picture this. It's 1944. The Allies are planning the invasion of Normandy, and they've got a massive problem. The Germans have tanks, artillery, and defensive positions all along the French coast. Every real division the Allies send into battle is going to face brutal resistance. But what if you could make the Germans think you had twice as many troops as you actually did? What if you could make them defend the wrong beaches, move their tanks to the wrong positions, waste their resources chasing ghosts? That's exactly what the Allied command was thinking, and that's how the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was born. You've probably never heard that name before, right? That's because for decades, this unit didn't officially exist. The men who served in it went home after the war and couldn't tell anyone what they'd done. Not their wives, not their children. The whole operation was classified until 1996. Let me tell you who these soldiers were, because this is where it gets really interesting. The Ghost Army was made up of about 1,100 men, and they weren't your typical soldiers. They were artists, designers, sound engineers, radio operators, fashion designers. The Army literally went to art schools across America and recruited some of the most creative minds they could find. We're talking about guys who would go on to become famous after the war. Fashion designer Bill Blass was in the Ghost Army. Ellsworth Kelly, who became one of America's most celebrated painters. Arthur Singer, the wildlife illustrator. These weren't just soldiers playing pretend. These were professionals who understood illusion, perspective, and how to manipulate what people see and hear. The unit was split into 4 main companies, and each one had a specific role in the deception. You had the 406 combat engineers, who built the physical deceptions, the 603 camouflage engineers, who were the visual artists and designers, the Signal Company, who created fake radio traffic, and the Sonic Deception Unit, the 32nd 04th, who specialized in sound effects. Now, here's where this operation gets absolutely genius. The Ghost Army didn't just show up and plant a few fake tanks. They created entire phantom divisions, complete military units that existed only in the minds of German intelligence officers. And they did it through a combination of visual trickery, sound effects, radio deception, and even elaborate stage performances. Let's start with the inflatables, because honestly, these things were incredible. The Ghost Army used massive inflatable tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, and even airplanes. These weren't like the bouncy castles you see at kids' birthday parties. These were sophisticated rubber constructions that, from a distance or from the air, looked exactly like real military equipment. A Sherman tank weighs about 30 tons. The inflatable version, about 100 pounds. 4 men could pick one up and move it. They could inflate a whole tank battalion in a couple of hours. But here's the thing that made it work. The Ghost Army didn't just drop these inflatables in a field and hope for the best. They studied how real units operated. They knew that real tank divisions would have supply trucks, command posts, and specific patterns of movement. So they'd set up the inflatables in formations that matched actual military doctrine. They'd create fake supply depots with inflatable trucks. They'd even put camouflage netting over some of the equipment, partially hiding it because that's what real units would do. It looked authentic because they understood the smallest details that make something believable. And they didn't stop there. During the day, soldiers would walk around the fake equipment performing maintenance routines. They'd pretend to repair vehicles, check engines, all the normal things you'd see at a real military encampment. German reconnaissance planes flying overhead would see hundreds of vehicles and hundreds of soldiers maintaining them. The illusion was complete. But visual deception was only part of it. The Sonic unit took this to another level. These guys had custom-built equipment that could project sound up to 15 miles away. They recorded actual sounds of tanks moving, trucks driving, bridge construction, soldiers talking, equipment being loaded. Then they'd take these recordings and play them through massive speakers mounted on half-tracks. Imagine you're a German soldier in a defensive position at night. You can't see much, but you can hear. And what you hear is the unmistakable sound of an entire armored division moving into position a few miles away. Hundreds of tanks, supply convoys, the distinctive clank and rumble of Shermans preparing for an assault. You report this to your commanders. They move reinforcements to counter the threat. Except, there's nothing there. Just a handful of guys with speakers and recordings, hiding in the darkness. The sonic deceptions were usually performed at night because sound carries better and because the Germans couldn't verify what they were hearing visually. The Ghost Army would coordinate these operations down to the minute. They'd play the sounds of a division moving from position A to position B, creating the audio impression of a massive troop movement, while the real divisions were somewhere else entirely. Then you had the radio deception, and this might have been the most sophisticated part of the entire operation. Every military unit has a distinctive radio signature. Different units send different types of messages at different times with different frequencies. Radio operators have personal sending styles, like handwriting, that intelligence officers can identify. The signal company specialized in mimicking all of this. They would study the radio patterns of real units, learn how those units communicated, and then impersonate them. When a real division moved away from the front to rest or prepare for an actual operation, the Ghost Army would move in and start broadcasting fake radio traffic that made it seem like that division was still there. They'd send supply requests, tactical reports, weather updates, all the mundane communications that real units send constantly. German intelligence officers listening to this traffic would have no reason to doubt what they were hearing. Sometimes they'd create entirely fictional units with their own radio signatures and communication patterns, building up a phantom order of battle that existed only on the airwaves. The Germans would track these fake units, assign them positions on their intelligence maps, and make strategic decisions based on forces that weren't real. Now, the fourth element of the Ghost Army's deception was perhaps the most human and the riskiest: special effects. These soldiers would actually go into nearby towns in uniform, wearing the patches of the units they were impersonating. They'd visit bars, restaurants, talk to locals, deliberately let slip information about their unit and where it might be heading. They knew that French civilians might be informants for the Germans, or that information would eventually filter back through loose talk. This was incredibly dangerous work. These guys were operating near the front lines, often within artillery range, sometimes within a few miles of German positions. They were pretending to be units that didn't exist, and if they were captured, their unconventional status meant the Geneva Convention protections might not apply. They were essentially spies in American uniforms. But they kept doing it, operation after operation, because it worked. The combination of visual, sonic, radio, and human deception created illusions so convincing that German commanders made real strategic decisions based on false information. Let me tell you about Operation Viersen, because this one shows you just how effective these guys were. This happened in March 1945, near the Rhine River. The Allies were planning a major crossing, and they needed to draw German attention away from the real crossing point. The Ghost Army created a fake buildup near Viersen. They set up inflatable tanks and artillery. They broadcast radio traffic, suggesting that the Ninth Army was preparing to cross there. The Germans bought it completely. They reinforced their positions near Viersen, moved artillery and armor to counter the phantom threat. Meanwhile, 20 miles south, the real crossing happened with significantly less resistance. The Ghost Army's deception directly saved lives. Real soldiers crossed that river and faced fewer German guns because the enemy was looking in the wrong place. Operation Brest is another incredible example. The Ghost Army simulated the presence of 6 full battalions, complete with all the radio traffic and visual elements, drawing German attention while the real forces operated elsewhere. The deception was so convincing that German commanders committed troops to defend against an attack that never came. But here's what really gets me about this story. These soldiers were living with constant danger, creating these elaborate deceptions, sometimes within earshot of German positions, and they couldn't tell anyone what they were really doing. The psychological weight of that must have been enormous. They watched other units get recognition, medals, parades, while their work remained invisible. The official records of their service were classified. When they came home after the war, they had to remain silent about the most significant thing they'd ever done. Some of them didn't find out until decades later what impact their operations had. They didn't know how many lives they'd saved, how many battles they'd influenced. They just did their jobs, packed up their inflatable tanks, and moved on to the next operation. Between 1944 and 1945, they conducted over 20 major tactical deceptions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. 20 times they created phantom armies. 20 times they fooled one of the most sophisticated military forces in the world. The artistic skill required for this work was extraordinary. These weren't just guys blowing up balloons. They were studying light and shadow, understanding how things appear at different distances and angles, considering what reconnaissance photography would show versus what ground observation would reveal. They were applying principles of theater, stagecraft, and visual design to military deception. After the war, when these men finally could talk about what they'd done, many of them reflected on the strange nature of their service. They'd been soldiers who fought with creativity instead of violence. They'd used art to save lives. Bill Blass, the fashion designer, later said that his time in the Ghost Army taught him about the power of illusion and presentation, lessons he carried into his career. Ellsworth Kelly's experience with camouflage patterns influenced his abstract painting style. The story of the Ghost Army remained classified for more than 50 years. Think about that. These men served their country, executed brilliant operations, contributed to the Allied victory, and then had to keep quiet about it for half a century. It wasn't until the records were declassified in 1996 that historians and filmmakers began to piece together what had really happened. In 2013, there was a documentary about them. In 2022, they finally received the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. But by that time, most of the original Ghost Army veterans had passed away. The recognition came too late for many of them to receive it personally. The few surviving members who attended the ceremony were in their 90s. They'd carried this secret for their entire adult lives. What makes the Ghost Army story so compelling is what it tells us about warfare and human ingenuity. War is usually thought of in terms of firepower, numbers, technology, but the Ghost Army proved that deception, creativity, and psychological operations could be just as effective as any weapon. They turned art into warfare and warfare into art. The Germans never fully understood what had happened to them. After the war, intelligence officers tried to piece together why their assessments had been so wrong so many times. They'd tracked units that didn't exist, prepared for attacks that never came, and left real threats underdefended because they were looking in the wrong places. The post-war analysis showed that German intelligence had been systematically deceived, but the full truth about the Ghost Army remained hidden. There's something profound about the fact that in the middle of the most destructive conflict in human history, a group of artists and designers found a way to fight that saved lives rather than taking them. They were soldiers who created illusions instead of casualties. Their weapons were imagination, technical skill, and understanding of human perception. The legacy of the Ghost Army extends beyond World War II. The tactics they developed, the principles of military deception they established. These became foundational for modern psychological operations and strategic deception. Every military force now understands that what the enemy thinks you're doing can be just as important as what you're actually doing. The Ghost Army pioneered these concepts in a practical, operational context. If you're finding this as fascinating as I do, this channel is all about uncovering these hidden stories from history, the operations that changed everything but somehow slipped through the cracks of what we learn in school. Subscribe if you want more of this, because there are so many more stories like this waiting to be told. What strikes me most about the Ghost Army is the courage it took to execute these operations. These men were artists and designers, many with no prior military experience, who volunteered to go into combat zones armed with nothing but inflatable equipment and sound recordings. They were creating elaborate theatrical productions within range of enemy artillery. One mistake, one detail that didn't match, one reconnaissance flight at the wrong moment, and the entire deception would collapse. The Germans would know they'd been tricked, and these soldiers would be in serious danger. But they kept doing it. Operation after operation, Deception after deception, they perfected their craft. They learned what worked and what didn't. They adapted their techniques. They became better at their unique form of warfare with each mission. The Ghost Army represents something extraordinary about the Second World War generation. These were people who found themselves in an unprecedented global conflict and responded with creativity, dedication, and sacrifice. They did whatever was necessary to win, even if it meant their contributions would remain invisible for decades. Today, when we think about World War II, we think about D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, the liberation of Paris. We rarely think about the phantom divisions that drew enemy attention away from real operations. We don't consider the inflatable tanks that saved actual tanks from being destroyed. We forget about the artists who painted fake insignia on real trucks to make them appear to be different units entirely. But these operations mattered. They influenced the outcome of battles. They shaped strategic decisions. They saved lives. The Ghost Army's work was as significant as any conventional military operation, even if it looked completely different. There's a lesson here about the nature of contribution and recognition. The most important work isn't always the most visible work. Sometimes the greatest impact comes from operations that, by their very nature, must remain secret. The Ghost Army soldiers understood this. They did their jobs knowing they might never receive credit, never be acknowledged, never have their stories told. And yet, now, decades later, we know. We know what they did, how they did it, and why it mattered. Their story has finally been told, even if it came too late for most of them to hear it. The Ghost Army is a reminder that war isn't just about force and firepower. It's about strategy, psychology, deception, and understanding your enemy. The Allies won World War II through a combination of industrial might, military skill, and operations like those conducted by the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The fake armies were as important as the real ones. The illusions were as valuable as the truth. So the next time someone tells you that art and design are impractical, that creative fields don't matter in the real world, remember the Ghost Army. Remember that artists and designers fooled the German military repeatedly, contributed to Allied victory, and saved countless lives. Remember that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a weapon at all. It's imagination. This is the story they kept secret for 50 years. The tactical deceptions that changed battles without firing a shot. The phantom divisions that existed only in paint, rubber, sound recordings, and radio signals. The soldiers who fought with creativity instead of violence. This is the story of the Ghost Army. If this kind of hidden history is what you're here for, do me a favor and subscribe. There are so many more stories like this, and I want to share all of them with you. Drop a comment and let me know what you think about this operation. Did you know about the Ghost Army before this video? What other secret operations from history should we cover next? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.